welcome to this 8th panel on politics and international relations. So today we'll be listening to 3 presentations by myself, by Giulia Garbani, and by Sasaki later. And after the presentations, which will last 20 minutes each, we'll save sometimes around 30 minutes for questions and answers with the audience. So let me start by sharing the screen. Where is it? It's here. Okay, so now you're supposed to see my screen. Yes. So yes, my presentation is entitled "The Ambiguities of Populism and Political Distrust in Japan since 2012, because it's focusing on Prime Minister Abe's communication strategy. And its main objective is actually to analyze the ambiguities of contemporary successful populism. Okay, and before talking about that, let me just introduce myself rapidly. I'm actually associate professor at Waseda University in the School of International Liberal Studies, which is actually created in 2004, so it's quite a recent department, focusing on classes in English. And I'm actually teaching classes about French politics there, but my degree is in, well, international politics, including Japanese studies. So talking about the ambiguities of successful populism can be done in different ways, and my strategy consisted in focusing on a central case that is not defined as populist, which is the case of Shinzo Abe, who clearly is not a populist leader identified as such. But what is interesting for me is that his communication strategy somehow reflects a semi-populist strategy with some elements of populism and some elements of something different than populism. And as described by Tina Barrett in the article Abe Road, communication is one aspect of his political success. Okay, probably not the most important one, but an important aspect, as you probably remember this picture, which was published on the Prime Minister website in 2013. Another way to analyze the ambiguities of contemporary populism is to somehow not define precisely what populism is. You probably know that in the literature of populism, there are many definitions that can be divided into 2 main branches: populism identified as an ideology or as a political style. So I would be more on the style side, but not with a clearly identified like fixed definition. And in fact, populism, depending on the case study, can include many elements combined in different ways: a call to the entire people beyond traditional cleavages, against some elites with a simplified message, a charismatic leadership, direct connection with the citizens, etc. Okay, there have been already many works on the patterns existing in the Japanese style of populism. But in this case, what is interesting is to see that how the communication strategy of Abe has been imitating the successful one of Koizumi Junichiro in the last decade, who was defined as, well, the first populist, at least at the top of the Japanese government. Besides, another interesting element consists in showing how Japanese political system or ecosystem smoothly leads toward elements of populism. There is something like a populismization of Japanese politics. I know the word is not very pretty, but it clearly defines that there is a personalization of politics, presidentialization of the institutions, giving more power to the prime minister, at the same time an increasing political distrust, etc., that in the end may encourage element of populism, even if there is no strong populist party or populist leader identified as such. So this is why I think it's interesting to study the communication strategy by looking at a central case. And today I would like to present you some discoveries in what I looked at when I looked at the Prime Minister's Instagram accounts. Instagram is interesting because it creates a direct connection between the leaders and the citizens, so beyond mediations like political parties. And at the same time, it's popular among the youth who are depoliticized. So Sakari-san probably talk about that later too. So my ambition was to grab all the posts that Abe Shinzo posted on his official account during his term. So around like 488 posts, and analyze them by using an inductive method. So not from starting from a definition, but by looking at the data and seeing the categories emerging from them. With some questions in mind, of course, that you can see here about the nature of a political message, the political target, how were the youth targeted or not, and the political leadership behind that. Is Prime Minister Abe showing like a charismatic, like personalized leader, or more like a representative of his party or just the government? So after looking at the data, those are the categories emerging from them. I've listed them here in a well-designed way to separate what concerns like policy making, okay, promoting the action of a government, elements related to the private person of Abe Shinzo, his action as a person, or other elements as like foreign policy, for example, other aspects. So I quantified the presence of all those dimensions in all the posts that Abe published on his Instagram account, and here are the results, okay? With three main dimensions. The first being foreign policy, the second showing himself as a caring leader, okay, and the last being related to commemorations and rituals. So let me describe a little bit more what is included in the data. So the most important aspect was related to foreign policy, and the fact that Prime Minister Abe was showing himself as somehow representing Japan in foreign with foreign leaders or in foreign summits. Okay, friendship with foreign leaders is an important aspect of his communication strategy. What was interesting to discover is that there are no posts related to Chinese leader. However, President Trump or Prime Minister Modi in India were much more present, and showing this friendly relationship was a huge part of his strategy. And another aspect was to represent Japan in diplomatic travels. For example, you see that the hashtag like summit or welcome to Japan or Abe visit, personalizing diplomacy, was another very important aspect. And as you can see on the left, there is also another category, Japan's success in the world, basically consisted in complimenting Nobel Prizes that Japan received during his term. At the same time, a second important dimension was to present himself as a caring leader meaning that every time there was a typhoon, or in the end of his term, a coronavirus, posts were published showing the Prime Minister meeting with victims, showing grief, and at the same time supporting and accompanying the work of the self-defense forces as a force caring, helping the population. And this was another very important dimension of his communication strategy, and it clearly refers to personalized leadership in a way that he presented himself as a protector of the people. A third important aspect was, as I said, commemorations and rituals. Lots of posts are related to scheduled events. Okay, for example, commemorating March 11th, the Fukushima incident, or the end of the world wars, etc. When there are 29 posts showing Prime Minister Abe vowing, okay, as you can see here on the pictures, or other posts related to the Tenno, the emperor, or lots of seasonal rituals. Typically the sakura season in spring, but there are other cases like this. I don't really know for now, it's just the research is just beginning, what it means in terms of connecting to the population, but I think it's an interesting aspect to be noticed. Then another part of this ritualized communication concerns sports, which was massively present. mostly probably because of the events which were organized during the end of his term, the Rugby World Cup, or well, the Olympic Games that were supposed to take place last year. And lots of posts actually consist in commemorating and congratulating, the success of Japanese athletes with, once again, a very personalized communication. You can see, for example, Prime Minister Abe here represented as Super Mario, or with a Japanese team jersey, and etc. Then another very important aspect to me, who is interested in populism studies and charismatic leadership, is how, well, sometimes, not very frequently, but still, it was quite important in the beginning when he created his account, a prime minister presenting himself as a private person, and especially in private, cute person, if I may, with the hashtag Abe-chan, coming 12 times. Or in the comments, a troll account writing kawaii all the time, and I don't know how to analyze it for the moment. But this aspect clearly, to me, consists in an imitation of Prime Minister Koizumi's style, which distinguished himself from other populist leaders by presenting himself as like kawaii, cute or fragile in a way. But this question needs to be digged a little bit more. This cuteness, can you see, yes, is also connected to the high presence of food in the post. And you can see the hashtag Abe-chan on the top left picture, for example. And it's a way to present the prime minister as a common man, private person, doing things that all salarymen or citizens can do in their free time, and not as someone from the elites. Okay, so try a way to look like the average citizen. There are plenty of examples of pictures like this. It was hard to choose the most interesting one. Then another element related to the cuteness strategy consisted in showing kids and animals with the prime minister 17 times, mostly children. So no need to enter the details about that, but it's also in between caring, showing like personal qualities like empathy, and at the same time a certain cuteness of, well, the Japanese population. It's, well, hard to analyze it for the moment. And last but not least, another way to connect to the population consisted in showing, well, attributes of Japan, like Fuji-san, or you can see a torii on the left picture, or here the Tokyo Sky Tree on the right, or celebrities like the music band Exile, very popular in Japan still now. And so lots of like visual signs that shows a connection to the nation somehow. So in the end, where is politics in all of this? It was actually interesting to notice that politics, so for example, campaigning, having positions in public debates, was almost absent. The number of posts seems high here, but it's actually very concentrated in one period, which was the 2019 upper house elections. Lots of posts about the campaign during a very limited amount of time. But apart from that, politics is almost absent from the content. Prime Minister Abe never engaged in topics that could divide the country, okay, or just never propose, never give any opinion on what is happening. And at the same time, there was also quasi absence of policy. Prime Minister Abe never promoted reforms, never referred to economy, which was actually very interesting to see. And there were only 5 reforms promoted, and they were basically related to, well, what to do against COVID-19, or sometimes very neutral messages promoting like women leadership. But in the end, it was clear from the analysis of Abe Shinzo's Instagram account that at first he showed himself as a protector of the whole people, of the whole country, by focusing on, well, caring, as I said, and foreign policy. and it revealed to me a certain presidentialization of a prime minister. Okay, so Prime Minister Abe was not presenting himself as the head of a government, but somehow the head of state, the president of Japan, with a strong focus on the regalian function. At the same time, the absence of policy in politics was also very relevant, and it showed a consensual and neutral content, de-ideologized, and a way to represent a central leadership beyond political cleavages, or without political cleavages. And somehow it's connected to the fact that Instagram account may be targeting the youth, because lots of polls show that for the younger generations, the Jiminto, of the Liberal Democratic Party, is not perceived as a conservative party, but rather a central one. Okay, and somehow it feeds this representation. And at the same time, the manufacturer direct linked through Instagram was focusing a lot on the nation or people through cultural elements that were somehow naturalized. Commemoration rituals, sports, food, lots of symbols like Fujisan, etc. And it's also a way to depoliticize the prime minister and make it like a central representative. And in the end, it's a good illustration of what has been identified as a Japanese style of populism, with an ambiguous or indirect call to the entire population without a strong message, and also without a direct anti-elitism or a strategy consisting in denouncing an enemy. There is no enemy here, only consensus and neutral content and protection of the people. However, it's hard to distinguish between what is implied by Instagram as a medium for communication and what is clearly part of the political marketing strategy. Well, the second option was clearly represented in a communication video entitled Shinjidai in 2019, targeting the youth, showing Prime Minister Abe. I would recommend you to look at that on YouTube later, showing Prime Minister Abe talking to 5 young citizens with personal ambitions and having for main message that the LDP is here to help the youth accomplishing their dreams, but without any strong political stance. Okay, so I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and I will be pleased to answer to all the questions. Thank you. So now let's move on to the second presentation. So Julia, it's now your turn. Can you share your screen?
Okay, here we go.
Thank you.
Yes, so it's great to actually be after you, Javier, because I'm taking us back in time a bit, but there are a lot of interesting continuities and historical precedents when it comes to a premier that wants to be a president, especially in foreign policy. So this talk here is part of my doctoral research, which looks very broadly at the role of special envoys in Japanese foreign policy in the early post-war. And in this case, I examined the implications of Japan's attempted mediation in Confrontation for Japanese leadership, essentially, what it means to for our understanding of Japanese premiership in the early post-war period. So, okay, so just to make sure everyone is on the same page, Confrontasi is the confrontation policy that Indonesian President Sukarno adopted in 1963 when the Federation of Malaysia was created. The Federation of Malaysia was a problem from Sukarno's point of view because it did not include only the Malayan Peninsula and Singapore, but also the 2 provinces of Sarawak and Sabah in northern Borneo, which Sukarno believed to be a neo-colonial scheme to threaten the sovereignty of Indonesia. So these provinces were disputed not only by Indonesia, but also by the Philippines. So it wasn't really heated confrontation. It was mostly a prolonged period of diplomatic tension with some border skirmishes and very heated rhetoric, especially on the Indonesian part. So the slogan at the time was that of Ganyang Malaysia, which means let's crush Malaysia, which was Sukarno's most famous call. And here you have on the right a few of the salient dates of attempts to solve the dispute, which see Japan play the first unilateral role in Asia after the Second World War. So we have, first of all, an attempt at a summit in Bangkok in early 1964, which failed. Then again, in June 64, the Ikeda government pushed for another summit in Tokyo, which was also not successful. And then the crisis continued to escalate as in January 1965, Sukarno withdrew Indonesia from the United Nations and joined the so-called Beijing-Jakarta axis, which was perceived by Western nations as a sign that Indonesia was about to turn communist and that the domino theory was going to materialize in Southeast Asia. What happens? So it's important to keep in mind that Indonesia was a very important commercial and diplomatic partner for Japan in this time. Indonesia already had been called the second Manchukuo during the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere because it was really a fundamental linchpin on which the Japanese imperial expansion relied on. And then the father of the nation, Sukarno, was a very eager collaborator of the Japanese in Java. He leveraged the Japanese military support in trying to liberate the Dutch East Indies from colonial control of the Netherlands. And also his third wife, Devi Fujin, whom you might know if you watch Japanese TV shows, was obviously a Japanese national, and he married her in '62. So Japan had a lot at stake in Indonesia, especially after the collapse of China and the access to the Chinese mainland market after '49. And there was a very strong interest in maintaining good relations with Indonesia. So Japan played immediately a very important role in trying to solve Confrontation and ensure the peace and security of the Southeast Asian region. The interesting thing is that in 1965, at the height of the crisis, the Sato administration decided to pursue a different style of foreign policy, which relied on appointing a special envoy. In this case, it was the vice president of the Liberal Democratic Party, Kawashima Shojiro, whom you see here below Sukarno. And he was sent to Southeast Asia twice, the first time in April '65, in occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, to which he also attached a brief layover in Kuala Lumpur and Bangkok. And then the second visit took place in August '65, just a few weeks before Sukarno was deposed by a military coup in September of the same year. Spoiler, it was complete failure. Kawashima did not succeed in bringing together the two parties to the negotiating table. And this is, I think, part of the reason why the Japanese involvement in Confrontation has been so overlooked in the literature on the topic. If we look at Anglophone scholarship on Confrontation, such as work by Mackey or Jones, there is absolutely no reference to Japan, if not really just in passing. From the Indonesian perspective also, there hasn't really been granted, I do not read Bahasa, but the one that has been translated in English does not really account for a Japanese attempted mediation in Confrontation, focusing much more on the reparation contracts, which were obviously the most important element of foreign policy at the time. And also in Japan, it's quite telling that the work by Nishihara Masashi, which was published more than 40 years ago, is still considered the benchmark when it comes to looking at Japanese involvement in Confrontation. And his work has been recently completed by archival focused research by Miyagi Taizo and James Llewellyn as well. However, what I'm trying to do with my research here is not to dig deeper into trying to explore the when and what, but most likely I'm more interested in the how. Why did the Sato administration rely on a special envoy in 1965? So I think that envoy diplomacy is even though it was a failure, it's very useful because it sits at the intersection of what I think are the two major fault lines of Japanese post-war politics. At the domestic level, it speaks to the question of who actually rules, who makes policy, and the rivalry over policymaking dominance between bureaucrats and politicians. And then at the international level, also, what role should Japan play in the post-war, especially in Asia? In this presentation, I'm going to focus much more on the domestic level and the executive element of envoy diplomacy, but I'll mention briefly the other one as well. So envoy diplomacy is evidently a tool of an executive foreign policy. Special envoys are appointed usually by a president. They are a favorite tool of American presidents in particular. And so they seem a bit odd in the Japanese political arena, especially in the early post-wars. If we think that Japan has been, especially in this period, has been really characterized as being a leaderless state with a chronically weak premiership or with structural impediments for a charismatic leader to emerge, without really going as far as, for example, anthropologist Nakane Chie, who said that the Japanese soil does not allow for a powerful leader to grow in Japan. There has been various understandings of the Japanese political system as being a bureaucratic kingdom where politicians reign and bureaucrats rule, and or also other images such as the truncated pyramid of Karl von Wolferen from the 80s and so on. So instead, there has been much focus, obviously, on the recent Abe administration, and before that, also the Koizumi and a bit more the Nakasone administrations as well. But usually they're considered some sort of exception to the rule. And instead, I think that we can see some sort of early signs that Kante diplomacy was already there in the 60s. And envoy diplomacy, obviously, is a way for the premier to bypass the Gaimusho, the foreign ministry. And it relies on what has been unanimously identified as one of the most powerful tools for a Japanese premier to exert his influence in foreign policy, which is personnel appointment. And not accidentally, Sato was known also as Jinji no Sato, personnel Sato, because of his reliance on advisory bodies, or his willingness really to apply even young or unexperienced persons in key posts. Obviously, however, the difference with modern day Kante diplomacy is that there was no attempt whatsoever at institutionalizing it. Envoy diplomacy itself and the institution of special envoys is very loosely defined from a legal point of view, and it's very open to interpretation and to the discretion of the single envoy. So it was, rather than relying on institutions, it was a type of presidential foreign policy that relied on individuals, as noted by Hattori Ryuji, for example, in his work on Nakasone. So who was this envoy? Kawashima Shojiro was 75 years old when he was appointed to mediate in Confrontation. Despite this, he was still, as you can see from the picture, a very energetic person who loved sports. And he was picked as an envoy precisely because he was believed to be the closest politician in Tokyo to Sukarno. The two had become friends in 1962. Because Kawashima was the cabinet minister for the 1964 Olympics, and he traveled to the Asian Games in Jakarta 2 years before. And it's only thanks to him that the games in Jakarta did not fall apart, because Sukarno had decided to ban the Israeli and Taiwanese delegation from attending. And Western nations were pressuring Japan to withdraw their delegation as well in protest. And Kawashima was the only one that opposed that and instead allowed the Japanese athletes to stay, obviously gaining the eternal friendship of Sukarno and Devi as well. So there was a strong personal element here. Unfortunately, it was not enough in making mediation succeed. So what Kawashima and Sato eluded themselves to be pursuing was what they called the Chotoha Gaiko, which is Supraparty Diplomacy, a sort of translation of the the motto of politics stops at the water's edge. So the idea that foreign policy should be bipartisan matter, sort of represent solidified will of the entire nation. It was not the case because the policy fragmentation in Confrontation was also very visible. So from a party point of view, we had, in parallel to Kawashima's mission, for example, a separate visit to Jakarta by a member of the Diet, Utsunomiya Tokuma, who was known as a troublemaker within the LDP, not really abiding to the policy line of the party. And in fact, he went to Jakarta and sending completely contrasting messages and supporting Sukarno's reliance on the communist front. But what I find interesting here is really the rivalry between the premier and his envoy and the Gaimusho. So obviously we should look first of all at Foreign Minister Shiina Tsusaburo, who was very harshly described by the British ambassador in Tokyo, Francis Rundle, as being pretty clueless all around when it came to Confrontation, which, however, is a bit of an unfair assessment. It's true that Shiina was not particularly hands-on when it came to Confrontation, but we should keep in mind that at the same time, he was taking care of the last stretch of the negotiations with South Korea for the normalization treaty. So he was very focused on that. And on top of that, Shiina was also in a very difficult position because, of course, he was the head of the Gaimusho, but at the same time, he was also the second in command of the Kawashima faction, the Koyu Club. And in fact, when Kawashima died, Shiina took his place as the leader of the faction. Both men were proteges of Goto Shinpei, the colonial Taiwan administrator. Shiina was actually the biological nephew, and Kawashima was a young protege of Goto. So they were strong allies, and Shiina could absolutely not really do anything against his factional boss, really. So the person that took on the task of really criticizing Envoy Diplomacy was his deputy, Vice Foreign Minister Oda Takio, who, well, first of all, he was very offended because his Oda plan, which included an idea of a four-power conciliation commission to redraw the borders of Borneo, was not very well received by the British and the Malaysians, obviously. And it's quite interesting, especially if we look at British diplomatic sources, how outspoken he was in criticizing Envoy Diplomacy, and the fact that the premier was relying on an unprofessional, non-professional diplomat in carrying out such a sensitive diplomatic task. So Oda was generally very gloomy. He criticizes Kawashima and the politicians for wanting to do something. And also he goes as far as asking the British ambassador if he had any bright ideas that he could pass on to his politicians, obviously implying that Sato and the Japanese politicians had no clue of what was going on. Again, other documents indicate that the irritation in the Gaimusho for the presence of Kawashima on the ground. So, for example, there is diplomats that argue that Kawashima overstepped his role, that he had no authority from Sato to invite Sukarno to Tokyo, and feel that he may well have turned what was designed solely as an exploratory mission into something a good deal more substantial. Again, the definition of Kawashima's mission was very vague, and it was not well defined from the start. So it's clear that what Gaimusho expected was not what Sato and Kawashima were hoping to do in Confrontation. Indeed, Kawashima was far from being a model diplomat. He was described as wanting to bulldoze the parties into negotiations and as playing things up as hard as he could, even though the Japanese diplomats in Jakarta were scrambling to keep things under control. And he also did a lot of very interesting blunders because he reassured the Malayan Prime Minister Abdul Rahman, that Sukarno gave him assurance that acts of aggression would cease, when in reality Sukarno never really said anything of the sort and created media scandal. So he really did not shine as a diplomat. So very briefly, in the last minutes that I have, I also wanted to hint at the other side of the coin. So what Envoy Diplomacy tells us also about Japan's foreign policy in vis-a-vis Southeast Asia. So usually we have Japan portraying itself in the post-war as a kakehashi, as a sort of impartial bridge that is very generous, is committed to fostering peace, and in a very idealistic way, and pursuing this low posture foreign policy, teishise, which doesn't really expose Tokyo too much. But I think that in Confrontation, and especially with Sato's decision to use a special envoy, this conceptualization really crumbles a little bit, because it was a very strong statement on the part of Japan. And it was openly partial, because it was absolutely in favor of Sukarno and Indonesia. Japan never really attempted to look impartial as a mediator. And it's very clear from policy documents from the Gaimusho, where Indonesia is described in 65 as being the country in Asia with the greatest potential in terms of human resources and capital. And jinteki, butteki are really two adjectives that could really come out directly from pre-war assessment of the country. Again, Southeast Asia being considered as a whole as a senkyoku, a constituency of Japan, as much as Africa is for the European community and Latin America for the US, just a few years later. Kawashima himself had also been a counselor for the Imperial Navy, which, as we know, had been the institution that really pushed for Japan's southward expansion. And there is plenty of examples that really hint at how much Japan sort of believed to have a preordained right, an exclusive right, to act as a mediator and guide Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular towards peace. Foreign Minister Ogira, for example, said that the nations of Asia followed policies that may not necessarily seem rational to outsiders and cannot be really understood by Westerners. And again, more and more references to the fact that Sukarno was a troubled child, that is apparently irrational behavior needed guidance. So again, circling back to ideas of Japanese paternalistic leadership in the region. But obviously I can talk more about this later in the Q&A if anyone has questions. So thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much, Julia, for your very interesting presentation. So we will take questions after Sakari's presentation. So now, Sakari-san, the floor is yours. You said that you didn't want to share any screen, so we'll look at your pretty face for around 20 minutes. Good luck.
Okay. Thanks, that's very kind of you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sakari Mesimaki. I'm a PhD student in social anthropology at the University of Cambridge. I don't have a set of slides. I'm just going to talk at you. Hopefully that won't be too unpleasant. But yeah, so please bear with me. In a direct sense, my research project is about Reiwa Shinsengumi, the left-wing populist political party which emerged during the upper house elections of 2019. In a more general and theoretical sense, though, my project is what I'm provisionally calling Antipolitical Japan. This is my gloss for political participation in contemporary Japan, as characterized by a disengagement of citizens from formal practices of politics, the marginalization of politics as a compelling category for making sense of one's life, and the delegitimization of conflict and disagreement as aspects of democratic political engagement. The disengagement of citizens from formal practice of politics in Japan is evident in a fairly straightforward way from survey results that show a steady decline in participation in formal politics, such as such as voting and other activities conventionally, so in surveys, understood as political, things like donating to political groups or joining protests. But the latter aspects of what I call anti-politics, this marginalization of the concept from everyday life and the delegitimization of disagreement, these concern not only disengagement from what is conventionally called politics, but how the meanings and the content of the category itself are configured. So I'll suggest that Reiwa Shinsengumi's populist politics represents a challenge to hegemonic configurations of what constitutes legitimate democratic politics. And I think the contest precipitated by this challenge is quite an interesting opportunity to explore what politics means in an anti-political Japan. So the paper that I'm going to talk through, it's a little different from my abstract, which I in fact pitched to the sociology and anthropology section of this conference, but which was then moved here to politics and international relations. And it's true that a lot of anthropologists of Japan, while they deal with questions of power in their work, it's kind of the study of formal politics of parties and elections is really been mostly the domain of political scientists. So I'm excited to share my ideas with you guys, early stages as it is, and will be grateful for any sort of feedback and critique to kind of push these ideas further. So in this paper, I'd like to make a case for approaching politics as an ethnographic category. So that is examining not only what politics is to us scholars in an objective or analytical sense, but also what it is to the citizens that engage with it in their everyday lives. I'll start by demonstrating, hopefully, how this can help understand contemporary politics as anti-political. And then secondly, I'll explain why I think Reiwa and its populist nature makes it particularly sort of productive for exploring how these anti-political circumstances are contested and reproduced. I'll just start there with what is my analytical as opposed to ethnographic approach to politics. So here I follow a binary framing common in political theory and anthropology of politics as critique and contestation on the one hand, and as world-making and formations of power on the other. In particular, I want to foreground the political theorist Chantal Mouffe's way of formulating this binary, which distinguishes between the political and politics. So to quote Mouffe, by the political, I mean the dimension of antagonism, which I take to be constituted of human societies, while by politics, I mean the set of practices and institutions through which an order is created, organizing human coexistence in the context of conflictuality provided by the political. So the political is antagonism, and politics is when you create something within that. And so Mouffe is among these theories of post-politics. These theorists identify in the sort of era after the Cold War, a reduction of the realm of politics through a privileging of consensus, delegitimization of conflict, and foreclosing of political economic debate within the bounds of what is often described as a technocratic neoliberalism. Mouffe highlights the negation of antagonism by liberal ideas of consensus as precluding the disagreement necessary for actually democratic politics. Jacques Rancière draws attentions to how political action is a contest over who and what the legitimate actors and issues of politics are in the first place, while then you have Slavoj Zizek, who locates what he calls politics proper in the contest over the taken for granted standards by which the merits and feasibility of different kinds of policies and social orders are assessed. And political anthropologists have drawn on these theorists to kind of investigate empirically and ethnographically how the boundaries of what constitutes legitimate politics are indeed themselves an important site of political contestation. And this contest over the sort of boundaries of the category of politics is what I'd like to investigate in the Japanese context. I'd like to begin with kind of a brief history of anti-politics, how this situation came about. Historian Nick Kapur, he sees the 1960 Ampo struggle and its aftermath as reorientating Japanese democracy towards a new brand of conciliatory, consensual, and consultative politics that saw closer relations between the state and an until then anti-establishment press, and also gradual turning away from politics by writers, artists, students, and the broader public. We know student activism did continue into the 70s, but as Patricia Steinhoff has written about this a lot, public shock at the violent action of some of these extremist student groups affected what she calls a curious temporal inversion, by which the entire period of protest came to be viewed retroactively as a prolonged agony of senseless violence that discredited all protest activity. Meanwhile, the conservative establishment sort of took advantage of economic growth and tried to shift the political climate from confrontation to issues of popular welfare. Productivity bargain established between management and cooperative enterprise unions lay the ground for the decline of the confrontational side of the labor movement. And by the 90s, the labor in Japan was too weak or unwilling to resist neoliberal initiatives to deregulate labor. And since especially the implosion of the Japan Socialist Party in the 90s, the parliamentary Japanese left and opposition have generally been very weak and fragmented. Parliamentary politics has lacked a viable alternative to the LDP, and the political spectrum as a whole has experienced depolarization and overall rightward shift. There's a few interesting sort of quantitative studies on that, which I can share with anyone who's interested. And the post-Anpo decades also saw the emergence of these highly influential theories about Japanese national character, the familiar Nihon Jinron ideas that posit cultural homogeneity, groupism, hierarchy, harmony, consensus, and this propensity for hard work as unchanging and timeless features of Japanese culture. These were actively propagated by businesses in the state as a way to promote loyalty and identification with one's employer and the nation. And so they help to kind of underpin this view of confrontational political activity as essentially sort of un-Japanese. And finally, these post-war decades also saw the development of a strand of political activism that was centered on the notion of citizen, shimin. And this was defined by its sort of proponent intellectuals in opposition to the rigid and ideological style of the left, and it favored forms of activism that are more open to cooperation with authorities. But even when, anti-establishment in its position, such as in opposition to the Vietnam War, this kind of activism was often framed as non-ideological, non-partisan, and against politics as something that was corrupt and morally suspect. From the 90s, citizen activism became increasingly subsumed into the state's agenda to harness civil society organizations for providing social services and reducing government expenditures. And as the Japanese anthropologist Akihiro Ogawa has argued quite nicely, I think, these state-led discourses around civil society sought to cultivate these very non-contentious volunteer subjects. And these volunteer subjects, they might well participate in forms of governments and providing services, even contribute to the formation of new policy, but without the ability to contest any of the existing structures of power in which that happens, I think it's doubtful if we can really call those kinds of participation as political in an analytically meaningful sense. So that brief history kind of shows how contexts like labor unions, campus politics, and citizen activism have been depleted as ways for ordinary citizens to participate in politics. And with the marginalization of the political left and the stigmatization of ideological and collective and confrontational politics, the prevalent ideas of political participation now represent, I think, a mix of liberal and these kind of Nihon Jinron ideals. And these ideals are very much privileging consensus and compromise and see conflict as something to be eliminated. And this quite neatly kind of constitutes what Chantal Mouffe talks about as postpolitics, the negation of the antagonism that is, in fact, at the heart of the political. And then further, without the kind of simplified interpretive frameworks that you get from things like ideology and collective political identities, politics becomes very difficult to understand and participate in for citizens who are left to engage with it on a very individual basis. The legitimate issues and actors of politics increasingly become those of expert technocrats who have the specialist knowledge and therefore the authority to engage in politics and policy. And instead of providing interpretive tools for understanding the difficulties one faces as a member of society and how politics could address these issues, politics becomes its own separate realm of political issues that are then handled by its own class of specialists. You've got politicians, bureaucrats, journalists, academics, and so on. And, with politics kind of mixed of this kind of ideological discourse of contest, the standards by which what is valuable and what is possible are determined by what, in this context, is kind of a naturalized neoliberal common sense. And this reduction of politics to a technocratic policy making is constitutive of what I think may be called a post-political imagination. And together with the sort of depletion of context for political participation and the decline of participation in formal modes, this is what constitutes what I call anti-political Japan. And in this context, what politics is as an ethnographic category, what it is to a lot of Japanese citizens is something that's very, very difficult, irrelevant, feels irrelevant to their everyday concerns, and even quite scary and dangerous thing in its capacity to generate conflict and division and scandal as well. So why is Reiwa so interesting for investigating what politics means to Japanese citizens? I'll first provide some comparison. So disengagement from politics has, of course, been problematized already in Japanese public discourse, and its remedying has been taken up by non-profits, government ministries, and even the PR campaigns of private corporations. Citizenship or voter education is often seen as a solution to address citizens' lack of confidence in understanding politics, and some initiatives also seek to address what is described as the taboo of discussing politics, so seeking to counter the negative associations it has and presenting it as something that can be positive and approachable, non-decisive, even cool and trendy. But most such initiatives are quite limited in two interrelated aspects. The first of these is that they're fairly uncritically within the liberal Nihonjin ideals that see political conflict as not something to be enacted in productive democratic ways, but something that should be avoided or resolved in a sort of definitive sense. And second, they relate to politics in a very discursive way rather than practical. There's a lot of talk about the importance of talking about politics or going to vote or expressing opinions and so on. And this kind of discourse is in fact really uncontroversial and easy to kind of reproduce, given that, in the abstract, political engagement has long been seen as this sort of civic duty or virtue. But then there is this reluctance towards actually doing something, like actually expressing opinions, no doubt because that risks conflict. So just to provide one illustrative example, during my previous fieldwork in Japan, I attended a workshop designed to encourage political discussion before the 2019 upper house elections. This was organized by the outdoor clothing brand Patagonia as part of their CSR efforts, part of their corporate social responsibility. But at this workshop, it was actually forbidden to express support for any specific political party or candidate. So the discussion mostly consisted of everyone just agreeing with each other and talking about politics, talking about how politics is very important and we should do it more, but not actually kind of saying what they thought about things. So it's an example of how an attempt to make politics more approachable by cutting out these scary parts, the source of conflict, and in fact, sustains these anti-political norms. So Reiwa is interesting to study in that it's, challenging some of these liberal Nihonjin norms of politics and creating a context where you can actually do politics in the sense of being for and against things, and not just talk about how voting and so on are important, which is a sort of safe meta discourse that is really kind of becoming increasingly prevalent. And Yamamoto Taro, the leader of the party, he's also very intentional about this sort of expanding the political imagination. So in his speeches, he explicitly and repeatedly, he talks about politics, about seiji, as what is a thing that can be used to change things and improve people's lives. Beyond that example, I think we can look to critiques of the party's populist, apparently populist nature, to identify some of the fronts on which it is challenging these established ideas of what politics is or should be like. And here my approach to populism is also ethnographic. So I'm less interested in how Dewa compares to formal definitions of populism, and more interested in asking what is at stake when that term is used about it. So as the anthropologist Jean Komarov has noted about the term populism, it's often, quote, more about marking difference than denoting content, and its meaning largely relative to the standpoint from which it is deployed, end quote. Writing in the Japan Times, the political scientist Lali Miura, for example, construes Reiwa as a cult-like phenomenon with unfeasible proposals supported by hardline establishment critics and voters with pure leftist ideologies. This in stark contrast to the majority of the electorate, which she describes as, quote, quite sensible in supporting a realistic security agenda and a moderately liberal economic and social agenda. And there you can kind of see the implicit ideals against which populism is compared coming out, sensible, realistic, moderate. So in a similar way to many other contexts in which the term is used, critiques such as Miura's represent an effort to police the boundaries of legitimate politics according to liberal ideas of political participation. Aspects of populist politics that come under criticism are usually violations of these ideals. Populists and the supporters are emotional rather than rational. They're ideological or Manichaean rather than realistic. They're part of mass movements loyal to charismatic leaders rather than these kind of individual critical judges of political competence. They seek confrontation rather than compromise and prefer simplified explanations of the world instead of an appreciation for the complexities of policy and politics. So in this way, how the term populism and critiques of populism, how they're deployed and by whom, draws our attention to these places and actors where the boundaries of legitimate politics are being contested, and some of the specific kind of axes, specific ways in which they are perceived as being transgressed, such as in proposing radical policies seen as unfeasible, or in excessive emotional investment of supporters in a charismatic leader. And what I hope to do with my research is to explore this ethnographically. Primarily that will be with fieldwork among Dewa supporters, but also with others who are exposed to or engaged with its political project. And I want to ask, how exactly do Japanese citizens, supporters, detractors, bystanders, respond to Dewa's attempts to redraw the boundaries of legitimate politics? And just finally, I should note that I'm not really embarking on this research with the expectation that Dewa will be successful at doing this or successful as a political project at all. Indeed, now polls show support for the party consistently below 1%. And of course, Reiwa is not the only political project that engages with the boundaries of legitimate politics in interesting ways. But successful or not, I think its challenge to mainstream notions of politics will be an opportunity to learn something about the resilience and maybe the vulnerability of these mainstream ideas. So thank you. That's it. I look forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you very much, Sakari-san. We are exactly on time, which is a miracle, I think. So now let's open the floor for questions and answers. We have around 30 minutes. So please feel free to write down your question in the chat function of the Zoom room, or if anybody wants to speak, this is another possibility. So is there any question?
Yeah, maybe I have a question, if it's okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, so my name is Arnaud Griveau. I'm an associate professor at the University of Paris, and I have a question for Sakari. I was wondering if you were also looking at the candidates and also the MPs, for instance, Reiwa Shinsengumi MPs, because there is a specificity here with the disabled MPs, and this is also part of, I think, that maybe a populist narrative, we could say, but maybe in a good sense, because they are closer to the people, they are not elites and so on. So do you also look at this strategy and what can we say about it? What could you say about it? I was just wondering that.
So this is kind of about what can we kind of analyze about the kind of candidates that Reiwa is picking for its I don't have any sort of analytical comments off the top of my head on that. I mean, I think, like you said, it's interesting that they're choosing, these candidates that I think there's a real emphasis on this idea of tojisha, the people who are actually experiencing things, disabled candidates, sexual minorities, and so on. Actually, one thing that I do think is interesting is I do feel like there is an emphasis on work that may be particularly interesting about Reiwa. Some of I'm not familiar with that well with the candidates for the upcoming elections, but the ones in the election where they kind of emerged, there was, this Combini franchise owner was kind of representing these ideas about overwork. There was one, very wealthy sort of financial professional, and he was there to kind of talk about, how sad it is that human value is marketized and this kind of thing. And I think, trying to politicize work more strongly, I think that's an interesting way in which kind of Reiwa is kind of trying to open up a new political imagination. A lot of the other parts are quite similar, I think, with other progressive parties in Japanese politics. So yeah, I don't know if that wasn't really much of an answer. There was something interesting there. Thanks for the question.
So there is a question about my presentation and two different aspects. So at first, about a potential difference between the Instagram strategy and other platforms. Actually, my research is just beginning, so I haven't explored this question yet. From what I know for the moment, actually, there seems to be a specificity with Instagram, considering that there have been lots of efforts made by the Liberal Democratic Party to publicize its policy, its members. But as far as I know, there is no official YouTube channel for Prime Minister Abe. I'm not sure what I'm saying. And somehow there is something specific with Instagram, especially with visual representations of his action. And at first I was interested in how Prime Minister Abe was targeting the youth and participating in a global turn of the Japanese youth towards the conservatives, as it was described by Sakari-san earlier. Besides, I haven't really looked at other the metrics, so the followers, the following likes, etc. At first, I wanted to have like a clear global description of like the concept of Abe on Instagram and try to measure somehow the weight of the intentions. without looking at the results and the consequences. So this may come later or not as a second step of the research. But it's actually very interesting, and I would love, just at first as a curious citizen, I would love to see what kind of messages were popular or not. If it's, for example, the cute dogs or Prime Minister Abe with Donald Trump, etc. It would be interesting to see. Okay, so another question about, thank you, about, yes, about Prime Minister Suga. It's very interesting because Prime Minister Suga also has an Instagram account, but for the moment I haven't seen any aspect related to his private person, and it's a very official kind of communication based on Suga being the representative of the government. So official videos, replication of messages posted in other like SNS, other networks. And so for the moment, it seems like there is no specific intention to make Suga, to build up like a charismatic leadership out of Prime Minister Suga, on Instagram at least. But it's still like still processing, so it may change after, well, the elections that will come rapidly now. But for the moment, it seemed to be quite specific to Prime Minister Abe. And what is interesting to notice is that highlighting the personal, like the private person behind the politician, was one of the original creation implemented by Koizumi, where at the time of what was called the Koizumi Gekijo, like the Koizumi theater, of him appearing on television to talk about like his favorite musics or his opinions about like movies, etc. But it was on television. Now, the mediums of communication has diversified and somehow complexified the marketing strategy. And it's interesting to see that some like elements are the same between like Koizumi and Abe, even if they are implemented in, of course, very different ways. So is there any other question?
While we're waiting for questions, I could comment a bit on the related to Instagram and those kind of things, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Yeah, I found in Javier, your presentation is very interesting, where you indeed described kind of this Abe's Instagram presence is very neutral and depoliticized. And you know, back in 2018, when I was doing my master's thesis, some field work, that was with a sort of community of these creatives, young creative kind of hipster types in Tokyo, who were trying to get young people to engage in politics by making it very cool and trendy. But also part of that was they tried to present it in a way that was very kind of neutral and quite sort of positive, you know, very like, let's provide solutions rather than criticize things and so forth. And these were all, you know, a lot of them very creative professionals, and they made very kind of slick, you know, materials to sort of you know, get youth to engage with politics and also push them in a sort of progressive direction, although that was kind of implicit because they also wanted to appear sort of non-partisan. But I remember this was around the time when the Shinjidai video that you mentioned, it came out, and they were really upset by that. They were really kind of depressed to see the other side also using this kind of very slick marketing. And it's kind of interesting just how this sort of contest over the youth vote and the youth interest is very, there's a lot going on at this quite sort of aesthetic level, almost kind of trying to make politics into this source of signifiers that you can consume like a brand for your identity. So that was just something I found interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was actually very interested in how you use Chantal Mouffe and this conception, the antagonistic conception of the political, taken probably from Carl Schmitt, right? And how it's interesting to see that indeed, and if I may connect it to the question that was been just asked there, how somehow the messages posted on Instagram, or basically, in my opinion, the communication strategy used by Prime Minister Abe is probably inefficient in convincing people to support him, but efficient in like covering a large amount of topics and neutralizing the public space and somehow silencing the opponents. And that's probably the most important aspect of this communication. I mean, young people are not interested in politics, so they may not follow the account of Prime Minister Abe for sure, but somehow Prime Minister Abe, his persona, managed to cover a large amount of consensual topics, and by doing that, remaining at somehow at the center of the public scene. And this like agenda setting effect is probably more important than the political effect of convincing voters to support his party. So this dimension seems more important in my opinion. Yeah. If I may add another comment, I found very interesting that there are some connections between our three presentations regarding the way to apprehend Japanese politics. And somehow I felt that in all the speeches, that the question of the nature of a Japanese democracy remains very important. And you cited like canonical works from the 80s about like Nihon Jinron, or I say like Chie Nakane-san promoting a perception of a Japanese democracy as harmonious, without conflict and without strong leadership. And it's interesting to notice that even if now we are in 2021, we still need to struggle with those ideas. And I was wondering actually how in your research you deal with the aspects of Japanese politics that are not directly related to democratic theory, especially related to like the personal dimension. For example, Sakari-san, in your presentation, you explained that Reiwa Shinsengumi was described as a cult involving the charismatic leader. So strong leadership against what Chie Nakane apparently explained, right? And at the same time, Julia-san, your presentation really made me think about a concept of populist diplomacy, which is used sometimes to explain that diplomacy is managed, controlled by charismatic individuals, friends or enemies, that negotiate beyond democratic accountability and institutions. And I wanted to know, how do you plan to study that perspective, considering that the fact took place a long time ago and those like personal dimensions may disappear from the archives? Don't know if you have a strategy to deal with that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's a great point, and one of the themes that I'm exploring in my research, especially because the Sato case is particularly interesting, because he did not only appoint Kawashima in Confrontation, but also more famously, he used the secret envoy Mishi Wakaizumi-ke in the negotiations for the reversion of Okinawa just a couple of years later. And there is really this contrast between the Kawashima case, which was extremely well publicized, really was front page of all the main Japanese newspapers at the time, every day, with the agenda of what the envoy was doing, who he was meeting, and so on. And instead, the Wakaizumi case, where, well, things became known to the public only when Wakaizumi published his memoirs 30 years after the events. So there is definitely, it's part of envoy diplomacy to believe that foreign policy has to be carried out by sort of one specially, a uniquely suited person that has some personal connection, some sort of bond of trust with the head of the executive, and that knows the country where it's being sent to, and somehow this person should be capable of solving the situation without really having to ask even for parliamentary approval, because in the case of special envoys, they are personal agents of the head of the executive, so they do not need the Diet to vote on them, or they don't need to report on the Diet. So there is a strong element of presidential foreign policy in the most extreme executive form, and it is something that I want to explore. I'm also questioning how to really bring out the personal element. So far, I've been really working a lot on memoirs and accounts of journalists that were accompanying Kawashima also on his mission. So a lot of very small pieces that could help me make sense of the puzzle, and also what type of personal relationship we had with Sukarno. But yeah, it's still a work in progress, but it's a very important point.
Javier, can I ask you to reiterate your question? So it's about kind of how do we account for sort of personal or personalistic dimensions of politics in the sense of, you know, this sort of loyalty or in being channeled to one person in a supposedly kind of group oriented context. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, exactly, especially considering the nature of Reiwa Shinsengumi being a very small party for the moment, with not clearly fixed policy yet. Yeah, how would you deal with this dimension?
I'm not sure if this is a very comprehensive answer to how I deal with that dimension, but I think, you know, it's you know, a lot of time when things are discussed as populist, it's kind of, there's this sort of implicit idea that this is a sort of aberration, or this is a different from politics as normal, which is sort of non-populist. But I feel like, you know, if you try and imagine what a politics would look like without any populist dimensions, at least if we're working with this kind of fuzzy stylistic idea of populism, you know, it would look very strange if there was no charismatic leaders and there was no kind of emotion, and it was, you know, this kind of, if you had no simplified narratives or collective identities, you know, surely any politics, you know, needs that, you know, to have a sort of group that is for something, you need to have a group that it's kind of against. And I think, you know, I think maybe, you know, some of this, you know, disengagement, people pulling away from politics is because these aspects of, you know, doing politics, which are very hard to kind of like not have being part of politics, you know, if you kind of delegitimize those, or, you know, kind of, if that's kind of the wrong kind of politics, as it were, then what's kind of left after that is kind of unappealing and very difficult to, you know, it's kind of what I think I tried to capture with, you know, politics as opposed to policy making. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you when you highlight the normative dimension of populism theory. In fact, there is a large part of literature that considers populism as inherent in democratic systems. For example, there is a very interesting and short article written by Philip Schmitter, the American political scientist, entitled The Vices and Virtues of Populism, something like this. And so he highlights the negative as well as the positive effect that populism may have on democracies. And among the positive effects, as he argues, is the fact that populist parties or leaders can, how can I say that? They can make sure that popular demands are not neglected by the political establishment. And they sense public opinion and they raise some topics that were neglected before. And by doing that, they make the country more democratic by connecting people demand and a political offer. So somehow what you described in your analysis of Reiwa Shinsengumi make me think of this like democratic dynamic, which is like inherent in any like liberal democracy.
Yeah, I think the idea that they, you know, kind of, this kind of populist movement would kind of send a message to the establishment like, hey, don't ignore this thing, is an interesting one. I wonder to what extent it works in Japan, since you mentioned about how, you know, in regards to Abe's Instagram, how it kind of occupies this center that then kind of covers everything. especially using these cultural symbols and not really taking a stand on specific issues. And something that, I encountered in a lot of my, in some of my interviews, for example, as well, is this idea that the center is a really real source of kind of legitimacy, I think, in Japan. And then if you are outside that and you're the one, then you end up being in the position of opposing something which is being established. And for example, there was, I think this was a paper by Professor David Slater in Sophia University, who was researching the SEALS student movement back in the mid-2010s, and how part of their strategy, this youth student movement, was to try and present themselves as being in the center, like we are the moderate, liberal, common sense folks who just want some like nice normal politics, and the LDP and Abe here, they're the real extremists and who are doing these things and violating all these norms. And I think that's kind of an attempt to occupy the legitimacy of the center space. Whereas I think with Rewa, they are very clearly kind of coming from the outside, and I think that might be a big disadvantage to them in that context, perhaps. But that's what I'll hope to kind of learn if I ever get to Japan to actually do my ethnography.
Yeah, sometimes it matches with what I see in Prime Minister Abe's Instagram account, because as I said, it's very depoliticized with only positive, neutral content, and somehow it embraces a large amount of potential targets. And it's actually one of the interesting discoveries. I was expecting him to target specifically the youth and to show like very concrete elements of his like strategical turn of some kind. However, it's not what I saw. I just saw very neutral messages that were targeting everyone or no one, with no specific content, if I may. And somehow it may be partly due to the fact that Instagram in Japan is very widespread and not specifically used by the youth. And it's used by the youth, but the most important users of Instagram are actually middle-aged people, like 40, 50 years, like salarymen. But there are mainly women, much more women than men using Instagram in Japan. But in the end, the generational range is very large. It's probably why there is no specifically message targeting the youth. And as you said, no messages promoting any political reform that would in the end lead to like divide society on the issues, debates, etc. And I guess it's also the same for foreign policy issues. In my case, it was presented as very neutral, like Japan going to meet with America, etc., and with no challenging discussions on international issues as well. So this is why I think that Julia-san, in your presentation, didn't highlight the role of mass media, and if they accessed the information and they were capable of covering actions taking place like beyond institutions and official messages. And I would presume that media did not really describe what happened, right?
It was very interesting because Kawashima himself was a journalist very briefly before becoming a member of the Diet. So he had his network of former colleagues and friends that sometimes he took along in his trips to Southeast Asia. So he was pretty much in control of the messaging in terms of what he told them and what he could have expected them to write about. But it was surprisingly well documented in the sense that pretty much everything that Kawashima was doing was reported in the following day in the newspaper. But it was, I imagine that Kawashima was pretty heavy-handed in giving instructions of what to write, because the picture was very rosy. Well, instead, on the ground, it was really one blunder after the other. So it's quite funny to read.
Thank you. So I see that there are many questions in the chat. Let me just take some time to read them, sorry. Yeah, very, very interesting questions on Abe's strategy, because it's interesting to see that, as suggested by Theodore Shaw, it seems that Abe's strategy is a standalone initiative that somehow is not controlled by the party communication strategy. And it says a lot, in my opinion, about the rising independence of the prime minister and the implicit contract existing between the prime minister and the political party as a unique, institution. As long as the prime minister remains popular, somehow he is free to implement the political strategy, the communication strategy that he wants. And Abe managed to remain popular for lots of other reasons, and somehow it gave him the autonomy to implement the strategy that he wanted. So that's how I would see it. However, I'm not an insider of the communication strategy. It's actually very difficult to access to the PR companies that were used. So this is just a suggestion, and I for sure cannot know how much pressures, the relationship, conflict existed on this strategy, in fact. Yeah. So there's also an interesting question about Dentsu. Can Dentsu be behind Abe's Instagram? I actually have no idea, and I will be very curious to know why Giulio-san, you would raise this point. Is it possible to explain how did you come to this question?
Hi, I'm sorry. So I'll go online, I guess.
Thank you.
Dentsu was, I was told by a diplomat behind the spot that you've shown, the Shinji Dai. And there were, and this diplomat thought that Abe was about to actually run for a third term once that spot had run. Because it was, in 2019, and so he was running up his time. But so, and Dentsu, of course, is behind so many media campaigns in Japan. It's like the mafia, and we don't know about it, right? There is a military-industrial complex in the US, there is the mafia in Italy, and then there is Dentsu in Japan. It's the dark side of Japan that nobody knows about. So sorry, yeah, that's what I what I asked, and yeah, I don't know. It's just correlation.
Okay, thank you. I will definitely look into it, because it's like a black box. It's very hard to know exactly what happens. Oh, I see that Arnaud Griveau shared a book about it.
Yeah, but it's much more on LDP's communication strategy. So I mentioned if the Prime Minister's personal strategy is different.
Yeah, because it's hard to really study this phenomenon, because there is an increasing complexity of a communication strategy between the personal use of SNS for local politics, which is actually very new in Japanese politics, right? And at the same time, the distinction between the LDP as a party and then the political leaders themselves, especially the prime minister. So depending on the level of analysis, the methodology, the questions, hypotheses could be very different from each other. Yep.
I actually was wondering, Javier, if you have looked also at Aki Abe's account, because I guess it could fit well into your argument of sort of looking like a first lady, because she does try to be more than just the wife of the prime minister.
Yes, definitely. It's something that I would like to do in the next semester coming, because I was quite surprised, and I didn't expect her to be here, actually, and to see that the personalization of prime minister's leadership was also made up through a certain the presentation of a first lady type. And I didn't count the number of times she appears in the data, but I would definitely do it and look at her account. And somehow I hope that it will reflect to this personalization process we've been studying. Yes, Giulio-san, you have another question?
Actually, on Abe Akie, there is another funny story. And I strongly encourage that you look at it from a political communication point of view. She was managed by Miyake Kunihiko during the first Abe administration in terms of the way she approached her public persona. And she was presented as this funny lady that has an izakaya in Shinjuku. Oddly enough, then she would visit Yasukuni once Abe was unable to visit Yasukuni. Yes. She would campaign for LGBT rights, and she kind of like compensates for Abe. She would be the internal opposition. This is how she's presented. This is, you know, Julia is absolutely right. I think she really complements Abe because of what you're saying as well. But there's nothing political about his account. And so if Abe is every man, Akie is every woman. And that's half of the electorate. And so when he's unable to then go to Yasukuni, Akie goes to Yasukuni. When he campaigns for reactivating nuclear reactors, she's against the nuclear reactors. And, you know, they call her the internal opposition. I think it's clear she's a dummy. I mean, sorry. Or maybe Abe is a dummy. I don't know. Maybe she's the real power broker. But I clearly they're both using their images for political purposes.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Like what is we'll definitely look into it. It's actually fascinating to see how Prime Minister Abe as a person completely changed the way he speaks on television and the way he communicates, by broadly speaking, from the first term, 2006, to the second. Like, changed his voice, his way to dress, to stand. He clearly followed like media training sessions very efficiently. So it would be interesting to see if his wife did the same or not. So the time is now already over. So I would like to thank you for your interesting questions, interesting presentation, for your participation to this panel. And I would know we could end now with many food for thoughts, and hope that we could collaborate later on those questions. So thank you very much, and have a good night if you're in Japan, or a good afternoon if you're in Europe.